No mai, haere mai, nam hinui o te rā. Welcome to this open Zoom session. It focuses on the built environment chapter of our draft advice to government on the second emissions reduction plan. We'll open this session with a karakia led by my colleague Bevan.
Kia ora tātou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou I runga I te pauaka whakaata reo nei, tēnā koutou katoa, anei te karakia timatanga. Paua ki runga, paua ki raro, ruia, tuia, kōkiritia, kia mau, kia au, kia ora ai. He pikinga ki te rangi, kia tū I tai ao. He pau e hora, he pau a rangi, kia hora a papa, haumi e hui e,
Tai ki e. Thanks very much, Bevan. Ko Danny e toko ingoa. I am a principal analyst in the Buildings, Industry, Transport and Energy team at the Climate Change Commission, and I'm the facilitator of today's session. The Commission began public consultation on our draft advice on the 26th of April. Public consultation will run for 8 weeks until the 20th of June. The purpose of this morning's session is for the Commission to outline our built environment chapter and draft advice. It's also an opportunity for you to ask questions and clarifications so that you're in a more well-informed position to submit your views as part of this consultation. Engagement is at the heart of what we do, and your submissions will help the Commission improve and strengthen our advice to government. Before we get started this morning, a quick activity and some housekeeping. In the chat, it would be great if you could please write down your name, the community, business or organisation that you represent, and where you are in Aotearoa. This is really helpful for our presenters to get a sense of who's in attendance today. Today's session will be split into 2 sections. First, the team will talk you through our work and the recommendations. This should be about 20 minutes. Following this, there'll be time for questions and answers with the team. For this, please write your questions into the question and answer box that you can see in the Zoom rather than into the general chat. Thanks everyone. I see some of the names coming through already. That's fantastic. We will be recording this session and making it available on our website later, along with all of the other open Zoom sessions we've had on the other chapters of our advice. So that's enough from me for now. I pass you over to Ali and Brianna to take you through this session.
Thanks, Danny. Ko Alexandra Amos Seaton Aho. I'm the acting manager of the Buildings, Industry, Transport and Energy team. The way towns and cities and communities are designed affect emissions from land use, transport, buildings, energy and waste. So the Built Environment chapter, which is what you're going to hear more about today, touches on areas that affect all New Zealanders. So on behalf of the team, we really appreciate and value the time you have taken to attend this Zoom and the input we receive. It will strengthen and improve our final advice to government. In terms of structure, I will provide some context for the Commission's work. So apologies if this isn't the first open Zoom you've attended. We've done a number of them now. You may want to go and make a cup of tea because the content will be the same. My colleague Brianna will then speak to the Built Environment chapter, and there should be plenty of time after for Q&A. So first, a reminder of the role of the Climate Change Commission. The Commission was created in 2019 with the passing of the Zero Carbon Bill. We are an independent Crown entity. We're not a regulator, nor do we provide funding. What we do is provide regular, independent and evidence-based advice to the government on climate action. Our advice is founded on the science, evidence and analysis carried out by our experts on staff, and importantly, based on the input from stakeholders and the people of Aotearoa New Zealand. The conclusions and recommendations of the Commission are made by our board and not a government minister or cabinet, and it is then up to the government to conduct the policy analysis and consider how to specifically implement our advice. The Commission's role and its tasks are set out in the Climate Change Response Act. This slide shows the advice that we will give over the next 2 years. In red, we are currently consulting on draft advice to inform the strategic direction of the government's second emissions reduction plan. This plan will cover the years 2026 to 2030, but also beyond. And our final advice is due by the end of this year. As I mentioned above, it is then the role of the government to consider our advice and decide on the specific policy choices to include in its emissions reduction plan. From 2024, the Commission will provide annual reports assessing progress towards meeting emissions budgets and the National Adaptation Plan. In 2024, the Commission will also report on its view of the 2050 target, emissions budgets for, and the review of the inclusion of emissions from international aviation and shipping in the 2050 target. A call for evidence is open for these pieces of work, with more information available on our website. So this is the second time that the Commission is providing advice to government for an emissions reduction plan. And our advice looks a little bit different as the context has changed. The government has set an overall emissions budgets for the years 2026 to 2030, and our advice is about the direction of policy to achieve it and not what the budget should be. Given this, our draft advice is less about modelling and quantitative analysis and more about a qualitative assessment of the direction of policy. The government has also made its first emissions reduction plan. This covers the period 2022 to 2025, the period that we're in now. It contains around 400 actions and is still very much being implemented. Given this, our draft advice is focused on building on the work that is already progressing and not repeating all of our previous advice. To manage this, we've used a prioritisation framework that draws on the Act to decide which elements of advice to raise as proposed recommendations. It included the potential for how the opportunity, policy or enabler can help New Zealand meet the second emissions budget period and beyond, any gaps in policy, pace and timing of the action. For example, will the pace be sufficient to contribute to the second emissions budget, or will it lay the foundations for achieving future budgets and targets? What are risks to realising the potential? Equity considerations, for example, intergenerational equity, distributional impacts, any specific effects on iwi Māori, and what co-benefits does the action bring, for example, to health, well-being, economic development, or other environmental or ecological factors. These aspects are distilled from the matters that we are required to consider under our Act. Overall, the Commission landed 19 recommendations in total, 3 of which are in the Built Environment chapter. There are also relevant recommendations in our Transport and Energy and Industry chapters, which were discussed in Zooms last week. You can find links to these on our website. There is fewer recommendations than last time, and they are more streamlined, but in our view, they are more strategic and focused. So we're consulting for 8 weeks on our draft advice to government on the direction of policy for actions that Aotearoa must take to meet its climate goals and address climate change. It is then the role of the government of the day to decide on the specific policy choices to give effect to the emissions reduction plan. We understand that people are at the heart of policy, and it's important that our advice reflects what the people of Aotearoa New Zealand are experiencing and care about. We want to know if you think that our recommendations reflect what is the correct path that New Zealand should be taking to reduce emissions and meet our legislated targets. So meeting the emissions budgets requires concerted effort and timely action across all sectors. Next, please. Yes, thanks, Katie. This graph shows emissions reductions expected to achieve subsector targets over the first 3 emissions budgets. These figures represent the gap between the government's projected emissions baseline prior to the introduction of policies from the first emissions reduction plan and the sector sub-targets. This chart shows how emissions reductions need to ramp up over time across every sector as actions take effect and scale up. Mostly this shows a smooth ramping up, but there are a couple of exceptions. To meet the second emissions budget period, we anticipate the need for particularly large contributions from electricity generation and process heat. And to meet the third emissions budget period, we anticipate the need for particularly large contributions from transport. Emissions from the built environment don't fit neatly into these boxes and are spread over land use, transport, buildings, energy, and waste. So I'll now hand over to Brianna to talk through this in more detail.
Thanks, Ali. I'll give a bit of context on the built environment before diving into our proposed recommendations. The built environment plays a major role in our daily lives and influences our ability to reduce emissions, from the type of transport infrastructure we have access to the quality of our homes and workplaces. And emissions are generated throughout the life cycle of infrastructure and buildings. Infrastructure lays the foundation for Aotearoa New Zealand to thrive and is a critical part of the solution to reducing emissions and adapting to climate change. This includes how buildings, the infrastructure that supports them, and transport systems that help people get around are designed and built. It also includes where they are built. Evolving our built environment will take time. Many of the decisions made today might have a small impact in the short term, but benefits will accrue as we near our long-term targets. The government is currently reforming the resource management system, and it's important that they take the time to get a good system in place. However, consenting for low emissions infrastructure needs to be prioritized and accelerated now, and we can make a start under the existing resource management system. Delaying action until a new or perfect system is in place could lock in path dependencies and limit future choices. The Commission has proposed some low regret actions that government can take that will make it much easier to meet the longer term emissions targets. In terms of urban form, the way that cities, towns are shaped impacts emissions across land use, transport, buildings, energy, and waste. But existing urban form in Aotearoa New Zealand is not compatible with our climate challenges. Transport and urban development in Aotearoa are not well linked, as the funding and planning systems are completely different. And we also recognize that different levels of government have varying ability to influence the available tools needed to drive change, meaning that delivering change and meeting subsector targets could be a challenge, and greater clarity from central government about what local government authorities are expected to deliver would be very beneficial. And there has been progress on the urban development side of the coin through the National Policy Statement on Urban Development and the Medium Density Residential Standards. However, transport integration needs to become the norm with any development, rather than a separate consideration or an add-on further down the line. An effective land transport system is an integral part of the form and function of urban centers, as well as the connection between those centers. To improve emissions reduction potential, transport and development projects for an urban area could be implemented on a consistent and coordinated network basis, as opposed to standalone corridors. An integrated planning system can support towns, cities, and communities' ability to reduce emissions while enabling Aotearoa to be more resilient to the current and future impacts of climate change. Well-planned and designed urban spaces can also result in greater social equity, improved health outcomes, and lower energy consumption. Density is a key determinant of emissions from urban form. Denser urban development reduces per person emissions from towns and cities, but density needs to be done in the right places where it can increase communities' risk from climate change impacts. For example, urban expansion or intensification should not take place in vulnerable coastal or lowland locations, or areas that are highly exposed to climate-related hazards that can increase our adaptation burden. And so we've proposed that the government implement an integrated planning system that builds urban areas upward and mixes uses while incrementally reducing climate risks. Infrastructure is a part of the solution when reducing emissions, but also produces and enables emissions. A growing and more urban population affects the need for new or strengthened infrastructure against a historical infrastructure deficit. Making use of existing infrastructure and making it more resilient to the effects of climate change reduces the pressure on resources required for consenting and construction. It can also avoid some emissions associated with building entirely new infrastructure. When decisions are made in the design and build of infrastructure, considering the whole of that piece of infrastructure can reduce system-wide emissions, integrating climate mitigation into government decisions on infrastructure, and revising central government guidance, guidelines, and tools to ensure they factor climate outcomes into the decision-making process about infrastructure investments, as signaled in the government's first emissions reduction plan, is important. Infrastructure decision-making also needs to consider how infrastructure systems are interconnected. If communities do grow outwards, it would ideally be built alongside necessary public infrastructure, like roads, telecommunications, or public transport connections. One of the main reforms of the resource management system is to increase strategic integrated planning of urban areas based on a 30-year time horizon, factoring in population growth and environmental issues, and to increase the efficiency of consenting processes. Demand on the consenting system out to 2050 may exceed the ability of the system to respond in the short term. Recent analysis by the Infrastructure Commission estimates that under the current consenting system and the resource constraints within that system, about a third of the emissions reductions needed to meet the 2050 net zero target may be in jeopardy. The need for a more efficient consenting system is well understood, but it's linked to the importance of electrification, low emissions transport, and low emissions process heat for meeting our emissions reduction goals should not be underemphasized. The transition to a new resource management system is expected to take 10 years. So this extends across the second and third emissions budget periods. Any delay or ineffective reform can make it unnecessarily difficult for Aotearoa New Zealand to consent the infrastructure needed to support its climate change goals. There's also a risk that climate change outcomes may come into conflict with other outcomes. For example, making ample supply of land for development could encourage building out rather than up. The government should provide clear direction and approaches for balancing and resolving potential conflicts between system outcomes. Our second and third proposed recommendations under the built environment have to do with ensuring that we have healthy places to live, work, and play for generations to come. How buildings are designed, built, used, and located will impact emissions and our ability to adapt to climate change for generations. Buildings are long-lived structures, and they can set emissions patterns for the future and drive emissions in other sectors through demand for materials and fuels. From a production-based accounting approach, which is in line with international best practice and with New Zealand's international and domestic reporting, buildings account for about 4% of long-lived greenhouse gases. From a consumption-based accounting approach, buildings have been estimated to account for about 20% of gross greenhouse gas emissions. The government's Building for Climate Change program needs to continue delivering on reducing operational and embodied carbon from buildings. Continued updates to the building code is important, but building standards and the code simply outline the basic minimum requirements for any building. There are substantial benefits to exceeding these minimum requirements from a health, safety, and long-term cost perspective. New buildings and developments can be designed and built with a much higher level of adaptive capacity, much lower operational embodied carbon, and better accessibility. However, much remains to be done to address the existing building stock. The condition and performance of existing building stock is highly variable, which makes them more complex to address than new buildings. There are also fewer regulatory levers for government to pull to accelerate change in this space. For building owners, there are limited incentives to retrofit and to retrofit to a high performance building, given the upfront capital costs and potential disruptions during construction. During new building development or comprehensive retrofits, smart design choices can deliver lower carbon buildings at low or no additional costs compared to a minimum code compliant building. The use of engineered wood products, such as cross-laminated timber, should also be encouraged in order to reduce embodied carbon. But barriers related to consumer and developer behavior change, industry skills and capability shortages, and a lack of standardized tools and databases need to be addressed. Greater incentives may also be required to encourage uptake of low emissions options. For example, replacing fossil gas assets will be expensive for some households and businesses. But electrification alongside energy efficiency is essential for reducing emissions from buildings and reducing their heating and cooling needs. The technology is available now and is increasingly affordable. A recent evaluation of the Warmer Kiwi Homes program found that electricity usage through winter falls in a house fitted with a heat pump by an estimated 16% relative to a house without a heat pump installed, despite indoor temperature gains during peak periods. When looking at just the heat pump component of the program, the benefit cost ratio is 2. So for every $1 spent in the program, $2 are saved when using standard metrics. But when using well-being metrics, which places a high value on living in a warm, comfortable home, the benefit cost ratio increases to about 7. And there are other benefits associated with the program, including hospital admissions avoided, prescriptions avoided, reduced visits to the doctor, as well as reduced days off school and work. Continued fossil gas use and infrastructure expansion poses equity issues for future generations. As fossil gas use begins to transition out of the system this decade, its role will shift to that of supporting strategic uses, such as for electricity generation or high temperature industrial processes, rather than residential and commercial uses where there is an obvious alternative. This is why we've proposed that the government incentivize comprehensive retrofits to deliver healthy, resilient, and low emissions buildings, and that they prohibit the new installation of fossil gas in buildings where there are affordable and technically viable low emissions alternatives in order to safeguard consumers from the cost of locking in new fossil gas infrastructure. That's all for me for now, and I'll hand it back over to Danny.
Danny, you need to move your mic back down.
There we go. Thanks, Ali. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you very much to both of you for the excellent overview of the advice and the recommendations. And for everyone attending the Zoom, it's great to see a few questions coming through in the Q&A. And we'll work our way through those. That's fantastic. Just to start off with, perhaps one for you, Brianna. Given this is the second time that we have provided this advice, what would you say is the main differences between this time and last time?
Should I unmute myself first? I would say one of the key differences is the coupling of the recommendations on incentivizing comprehensive retrofits and providing greater support to replace fossil gas assets, coupled with prohibition on the new installation of fossil gas. So I suppose it's more of a carrot and stick approach as opposed to a strictly sticky approach.
Thank you. All right, let's see here. So we've got a question.
Actually, can I just really quickly add to that?
Sure.
I think that's exactly right, I think, from a recommendation point of view. But from an approach point of view, what we've tried to do that's different to last time is pull the elements of the advice that relate to built environments together in one chapter. And the intent behind that is to try and ensure there's like a holistic approach that is taken when thinking about the built environment and the associated parts of that. Whereas before, for example, we had urban form in a separate chapter, and then we had, in energy and industry and buildings, and it was a little bit disjointed. And the way that the government has also set out their ERP, there's just a lot in it, and there's a lot of different components, and we're trying to pull the thinking of that together into one. Just a little bit of an explanation of the intent behind the chapter.
Cool. Thanks, Ellie. We've got a question in here around the government's Building for Climate Change program. The question notes that the Building for Climate Change program is setting specific caps and targets around carbon dioxide emissions and energy, but the timelines for enforcing these caps aren't out yet. So the key sort of point here is that can the Commission include in our advice that it's critical to give clear direction and timeline to the industry and to regulators?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question and a really good point. And it's something that we've been hearing a lot from stakeholders over our engagement. And I would really encourage you to submit exactly on that point, because that really helps us when we're thinking about turning this into final advice.
There's one here, a question that's come through around the recommendation to prohibit new fossil gas installations in buildings. And it notes that this applies judgment to the prohibition around affordability, viability, and pragmatism. Who would apply this judgment, and how would this work consistently?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So what we've done when we've outlined this particular recommendation is we've tried to highlight that it isn't necessarily simple, and that there are specific, I guess, parts of the country or communities or even end users who may find this challenging, and therefore some pragmatism is required, but recognising the end goal that we're all trying to reach here, which is reducing the use of fossil gas. In terms of who would apply that judgment, to answer that part of the question, like this is our advice, our draft advice to government. Government would then, if they choose to accept this recommendation, and in fact all of our recommendations, they would pick them up and do the detailed policy development, and actually do the nuts and bolts and figuring out how this would work. And so how they actually designed that policy is up to government.
Thanks, Ellie. There's a question that's come in here around local government and regional government planning and decision-making structures. So the question is whether the existing local and regional planning and decision-making structures are sufficient to realise the integrated urban form outcomes that we have recommended. And I guess that the other part of that is whether there needs to be further central government direction.
I can take that one, Danny. Thank you for the question. So as part of the two frameworks that we use to develop our recommendations, the policy framework, one of the overarching pillars, I suppose, would be to ensure that we have effective governance structures to deliver on the transition. And in our engagement, targeted early engagement, as we were developing this draft advice on the second emissions reduction plan, we heard from a lot of local government councils that greater clarity from central government about what their specific role is in meeting the subsector targets would be highly beneficial. So yes, we are suggesting there needs to be further central government direction in these areas, particularly without that clarity and role specificity. It can be hard for them to access the funding and financing and the different kinds of resources that's required to kind of deliver on the emissions reduction plan, because we know that at the local government level, it's a lot of where the rubber hits the road in delivering these actions.
Thanks, Brianna. So a question here around the incentives in our recommendations. So they've asked, basically, I guess, for more specifics around what the Commission might have in mind for the incentives. Are these straight subsidies, or could we get more savvy with things like rates, building levies, and also a sort of second question around the scope of that? Is it just homes, or does it include all buildings?
So I can take that one, Danny, thanks. In terms of the types of incentives, I assume you're talking about the comprehensive retrofits. And as Danny alluded to, there are quite a lot of tools in the toolbox of incentives that can kind of drive an accelerated pace of comprehensive retrofits, whether that's residential, commercial, or public buildings. So we haven't specified the type of incentives that we're looking for government to deliver on. As the government of the day, we need to undertake the specific and detailed policy analysis in order to identify which would be the most effective in driving that kind of action. So it could be grants, it could be loans, green loan guarantees, Properties Has Clean Energy loans. It could be at a different level of government where you look at the tools within the consenting system, or you look at the tools that local government has in terms of rates. So those are kind of a toolbox of incentives that the government can look at, but it'll be up to them to kind of determine that the specific incentive for the outcomes that they're targeting.
Thanks, Brianna. And there's kind of a follow-up that's come through around retrofits. Based on the presentation today, are heat pumps and space heating the priority for incentives?
I can take that one as well as a follow-up. I would say electrification is definitely a prioritization. So as your potentially your heating or cooling appliances is coming to its end of life, the consideration of using a heat pump for your heating and cooling needs should be prioritized. As if it should be prioritized for incentives, yes. So coupling that with ensuring that your thermal envelope is up to spec as well, so that you can improve your thermal efficiency and not have to run the heat pump quite as high or quite as much to kind of achieve that same indoor temperature and comfort level that you're seeking. I think that was the question.
Thank you. Okay. How do you see phasing out those still heating with biomass or coal, as these seem to differ from town to town and council to council, or region to region, I guess?
How can you say that?
Yeah,
repeat
sure,
that again?
sure.
Sorry, Danny.
That's all right. So the question relates to, I guess, homes, I guess in particular, that are heating with coal or biomass, and noting that there's not kind of consistency across New Zealand around how to address this. So does the Commission's recommendations and advice touch on this? And I guess, yeah, if you've got any comments on how they should be addressed.
Yeah, sure, and completely appreciate that things are very different across the country and across regions, and there's different solutions for different people in different parts of the country. The recommendation that would be relevant to that one would be the one that Brianna has spoken about, and it should be about incentivizing households that use particularly coal, but also, increasingly fossil gas, is about incentivizing them to be able to switch out and move to renewable technologies, and in particular electrification, we believe should be incentivized where possible. I take your point about the differences in how councils apply things differently across the country, and that is a challenge. But what we think we should do is we should look to the future and look all to be moving in the direction that's going to result in people having the level of comfort, or even having a greater level of comfort in lots of cases, and recognizing that it may be expensive for some of those households to be able to do that, and to incentivize that and help people as is appropriate.
Thanks, Sally. Perhaps another one for you that has a slightly broader focus than just the subject of today's Zoom. There's a question there noting that there are no, so the Commission's got a section around enabling system transformation, but they note that there's no specific recommendations in that section And I've read the prioritization framework and want to better understand what led to no recommendations in the systems transformation part of our advice.
Sure. That is a really good question. We tried to be as targeted with the recommendations as possible. We had a lot of feedback that in our advice and in our Aotearoa, there was just too much and the system was overwhelmed with recommendations. So we tried to be really strategic in where we focused and look at where are the biggest opportunities or where could there be the biggest co-benefits. In saying that, system transformation is critically important here. So if you believe that there should be a recommendation in that section, I would really encourage you to submit on that because we will be re-looking at the recommendations and taking on feedback and critiques for how we have applied this framework. So yes, please put in your submission on that point if it's important to you, absolutely.
Thanks, Ali. And perhaps I can just add as well, if I think about the first time we provided advice, one of the outcomes of the public consultation was, bringing up, I think urban form was one area. There's a couple of, I think the bioeconomy perhaps as well, where we definitely heard from submitters the need for some kind of other priority areas and reflected that in our final advice. So I guess I would echo your point to those listening today that really helpful to get submissions on those points as well, and where you think there's perhaps cross-cutting areas that are missing. So second your voice on that. Another question for you as well. What role does customer willingness to pay play in the Commission's advice around renewable gases being given a kind of strategic use in hard to decarbonize industries?
That's a really good question. I think it depends on what you mean by customer willingness to pay, because the system we have at the moment, if you're talking about residential, but not exclusively about residential, they are locked into, say, fossil gas use because they have infrastructure. They may not have a great awareness of what makes up their bill. They may, so they're exposed to the ETS price, but they don't have a good understanding of that. And so there's a lot of things that are complexities in the system that customers, they may not have good awareness, and they may not actually be able to choose to move out of that. So they may not be able to afford to move into a different heating or energy source, which is where our recommendation about providing incentives to help with that comes in. Broader than that, the greater propensity to pay, that might be the case that, industrial players, they do have that because they are, they're trying to reduce their emissions. So therefore they may want to pay more for, say, renewable gases, for hydrogen, even for electrification in some instances. And they have other drivers that may mean that they are willing to pay more for the costs of more expensive fuels. You might have more to add to that, Brianna. I feel like I poorly answered that question.
It was well answered.
Okay, Brianna, well, we've got a question for you, I think.
Careful when you open your mouth.
Well, it's sort of a question, I guess, a call for reflection from the Commission. So one of our attendees notes that around 9% of New Zealand's emissions come under a consumption lens is from embodied carbon. And they note that without targets, the sector can be unsure about where or how to invest. They note it's essential to signal reductions are coming, and I guess a call for a strong recommendation to align with the World Green Building Council's call for a 40% reduction in embodied emissions by 2030. Do you want to, have you got any, thoughts, I guess, or comments around the issue of embodied carbon in buildings?
Yes, thank you, Danny. So we do know that as the operational operational emissions from a building declines, it will be the embodied emissions that remain. However, our emissions reduction targets and our analytical work program is based on a production-based accounting approach. This was outlined in Chapter 10 of Aotearoa and Chapter 3 of the 2021 supporting evidence. But in terms of setting targets to provide certainty for investment in the business community, MB's Building for Climate Change program, as one of the other attendees noted, does set caps for operational emissions, water use, as well as embodied carbon. So the call for, I suppose, really clear timelines on the implementation of that program is well heard. We do encourage you to submit on the impact of having that 3-year program still being in train and without regulated caps being set, and that timeline being provided to the public. As part of that program, there is a need to kind of upskill the industry to measure, report, and account for those embodied emissions on a consistent basis in order to keep track of where we are in terms of body emissions, and to have a consistent way across all buildings, and whether that's commercial or residential sector for buildings, to kind of report that and track that in a very consistent way. And kind of in line with that, as we said in our advice, having standardized databases and tools that the industry can readily use and feel confident in using will be really important. So we do hear you. There's a global call for greater attention on embodied carbon in the built environment, and it's slowly getting up to speed in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So thank you for your question.
Okay, thanks, Brianna. There's a question here around resilience. How has the Commission considered resilience in the draft advice? For example, the resilience value in a mix of energy sources for homes, different communities, or rather topically, communities more subject to weather events.
Yes, I think there's a couple of points of this, Brianna, you might want to tag team with me. Resilience, particularly from an adaptation point of view, is one of the things that we are required to consider as part of our legislation. When giving any advice, it's one of the matters that has to be taken into account. So while this advice is primarily about how to reduce emissions, we cannot ignore adaptation matters, and as part of that, I consider resilience to be a pretty crucial part. So yes, so while there is not a specific recommendation on resilience per se, and from like an energy point of view, the whole of our advice is just that, is that our advice, and we took into account resilience when we were thinking about making sure that the electricity system, for example, is able to support this transition, particularly in the electrification of heat and transport, and how critical it is that the electricity system both has a mix of generation in different parts of the country, but also that the infrastructure, electricity lines, but also other infrastructure is able to deliver on that and stand up to significant weather events. We've seen how critical that is, particularly in the wake of the cyclones this year and the impacts on some communities. Brenna, do you want to talk a little bit more about how we've thought about like distributed generation and solar and that type of stuff?
Sure. So across our recommendations for the built environment, buildings, and energy industry, the consideration of resilience for remote communities, we do advise that the government take a pragmatic approach. LPG bottles, bottled gas, it will be important for remote and rural communities and for kind of critical places in a community, marae, town halls, community centers, to kind of provide that central area for gathering in emergency situations, or to provide emergency services, water and energy, should households kind of lose access to those lifeline utilities. In terms of kind of providing increased resilience through distributed energy resources, we do encourage the Electricity Authority and others working within that space to make it easier for distributed energy resources to play a larger role within the energy system, in order to kind of decrease the need for new generation builds and to reduce peak demand, and to provide localized solutions to build resilience, whether that's community energy projects, whether that's a solar plus battery energy storage system on the community center, whether that's a used EV battery acting as a energy storage solution for EV charging. I know King Country Counties Energy is piloting that. It could be something that's in greater use over time as EV batteries meet their useful end of life in a vehicle and have another secondary super useful life in homes and businesses.
Thanks, Brianna. A question that's possibly for either of you. Are we also looking at successful international climate change models rather than reinventing a model or the wheel, as the case may be?
Are you talking about a model in terms of modeling?
I assume that the question here relates to, if we're talking about the built environment chapter, are we how are we taking into account, I guess, international best practice, that kind of thing? That would be my reading of the question.
Excellent, thank you. So we do look at international case studies, whether successful or slightly less successful, as part of our analytical work program. So there's quite a lot in my home country, in Canada, particularly for comprehensive retrofits and different kind of programs to kind of accelerate electrification, or to increase the efficiency of a thermal envelope for buildings. Germany, as well as Ireland, has quite a lot of work underway in terms of retrofits, as well as phasing out fossil fuel heating and cooling. So we do look at international climate change models as opposed to reinventing a model. And we leveraged some of Burrell and Brands's recent analysis on looking at overseas retrofit programs and their potential application to the Aotearoa New Zealand context as well. So definitely.
Great. I'm just conscious of time. So there's a couple more questions coming through. I might sort of combine together. So there's one that's come through which looks at basically the recommendation for urban density or building upwards. So they agree that transport and urban development are not well linked, and support that integrated planning system can support our ability to reduce emissions. They've asked for, I guess, a bit more information on the recommendations to have that integrated system. And yeah.
Cool.
If you've got any response to that.
Good question. So I think there's a couple of things that we're driving at there. One is that, you know, there's different developments or different decision makings that's going on that's being considered by different people at different levels. So you've obviously got central government in there, you've got the councils in there, and you also have like private developers who are making decisions that have real impact, but everybody's got different drivers and they may not be heading towards the same outcome. So that's one of the points. Another one that we're trying to draw out is that we think that the current funding structures are not well integrated, and what's happening there is it's overwhelming the current capacity to pay for the transport and urban form improvements. So I guess one of the other aspects that we talk about is that there's certain policies or there's certain like restrictions that have been in place for a long time. They're historically there because they came in under a system that hasn't necessarily been looking at driving emissions reduction outcomes. So they may have been there. I'm thinking like land covenants, which are often there to protect, you know, the amount of a property that can be built on. Whereas now we're trying to move in the direction of having more denser development with a view to, you know, reducing emissions in that area and ensuring that people can live like happy, well-connected lives in a less dense space. So, sorry, this is a very waffly answer to that question, but yes, I think that's a good question. And
thanks, Ali. There's a follow-up question, I think, that comes back to the building for climate change elements earlier. So someone in the chat has noted that rough timelines are out, 2025 for the first CAP and around about 2028 for CAP 2. They've noted what's more important is that we get the information soon so that the sector can prepare. We're less than 2 years away and don't have the modelling information. Do you want to note if anything you've got to add around what these sort of timeframes for that Building for Climate Change program?
Right, so we're talking about building for climate change specifically, not our emissions budgets. Brianna, I think that probably you're best placed to answer that one. I think the overarching point that you're making is that you require certainty, right? And that's going to help you make the decisions that you need to make. And in a world that you have less than ideal certainty, that's making it challenging for you, which I think is probably one of the barriers that we have identified across a number of aspects of our advice, is that it's very hard for people to invest when they don't have certainty.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit to that. There was a technical methodology for embodied carbon that was released in early 2022 to enable early adopters to use and familiarize others with the concepts. In terms of getting the information so that the sector can prepare and to have the appropriate modeling information, there are databases such as Brand's Construct database and various EPD documents and databases that are used. I guess for us and as part of our advice is for maybe within that program or outside that program, but to have kind of a standardized tools and standardized databases so that industry, whether early adopters or adopters along this timeline, they know what to use so they can consistently compare and track over time that progress and in meeting those caps and to learn along the way. So I guess for us, it's kind of pushing and kind of leaning into MBE's Building for Climate Change program. That the sector does need certainty, whether that's certainty of timelines or certainty of data or information or tools or training. I agree with you.
Okay, look, maybe one last question here. In this report, did you build scenarios based on GHG targeted reductions, and they reference the Paris Agreement? The context being, given our current built environment operational emissions estimates and what would be required if incentives fall short, at what point would more bold action be required?
Yep, cool, okay. Good question. I think there's a two-part answer. The first is, the first is we didn't do any updated modelling for this advice. The emissions budgets have been set, so we are not relitigating those. We're just looking at, for this period, the 2026 to 2030 period, this is in our assessment the areas that need to be focused on in order to meet that emissions budget. But I think the next point to make is the Commission has a monitoring role. So that will be kicking off more fully next year. And that's an annual role where we look at the implementation and the success of the government's emissions reduction plan. So as part of that, we'll be able to take a look at how successful that we're going to be in this area, and therefore, like, how much urgency is therefore required.
Thanks, Ali. And I think in one of the earlier slides as well, where we outline the work program, there's some information around that and the timeframes for that.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you both for your time and your questions and your presentation. And thank you everyone who's attended today's Zoom, and for those who will watch it online. A final reminder from us that public consultation closes on the 20th of June. Our draft advice, as well as the recordings of this and other Zooms, are available on the Commission's website. And we certainly look forward to receiving all of your submissions through the Citizen Space consultation portal. As I mentioned earlier, the submissions can really strengthen our advice, and we know that from past advice we've given as well. So we're looking forward to seeing and reading and reflecting the submissions that come in as part of this process. Just to wrap us off today, I will ask Bevan to close us out with a karakia.
Tēnā koutou mua koutou whai wāhi I tēnei rā, anei te karakia whakakapi. Ka hiki te tapu, kia wātea Aotearoa, kia tūriki ai I te ao mārama. Haumi e, hui e, tai
ki.
Just for a translation, that means restrictions are moved aside so the pathway is clear to return to everyday activities, enriched and unified. Kia ora tātou. Thank you.
Kia ora. Thank you, Bevan. Thank you, everyone.